So today we will be starting the introduction to CSS. CSS. It is very very important that when you are building front end, you have to know CSS because as I said at the beginning of the class, I said HTML is just like the normal cake, but when you now add CSS to your application, that is the icing of your application. That is what makes your cake looks beautiful. So most of the time when you get a cake from a store or from anywhere, there is a cake, but what you see on the outside that makes the cake looks beautiful and what the cake is being decorated with is majorly the icing of that is what makes the cake looks nice and looks attractive to the eye. So with the help of CSS, we are going to be able to start making nice and high interactive websites. There is a lot to CSS which you can learn. CSS is a very powerful tool on the front end aspect of things because without CSS these days, I don't even think you're able to work at the front end developer because that's one of the major tools you need to have in your toolkit to be able to work as a front end developer, especially in this current world of how front end is changing. So we'll be talking about CSS, how it works, and how you can bring your CSS and HTML together and make a wonderful and more beautiful website or more beautiful web application that's going to be running on the web. So yes, let's start. Who can tell me the meaning of CSS? Like, does anybody have idea what CSS is before we even proceed? All right. So that's right. CSS means cascading style sheets. That's very good. That's the meaning of CSS. Cascading style sheets. So what CSS does, as I've said earlier on, is to add beauty to your already made HTML website. With the help of CSS, your users are able to see a beautiful website and not just your HTML. As I usually say, HTML is the skeleton, CSS is the cover work. Your body, because most of the time when people first of all meet you as a person, they don't tend to see your skeleton or what your body is made up of internally. What they tend to see is your skin that is covering all those things. So that is what CSS is to HTML. HTML is the internal body framework or body structure. Then with it gives you a better look. So that is what CSS is. So yes, I was looking at the cascading style sheet. And so how is this cascading style sheet being integrated into HTML? And who created it? So CSS was created alongside the web, and that's HTML5. I think 3 years later, it was created at the W3C um, company. The W3C. When we talk about the W3C, we're talking about the World Wide Web Consortium. So that is when what's it called? That is when CSS was created. So yeah. So when you are writing CSS, it is important that when you are writing a CSS, there is an HTML file because a CSS file can't stand it. It can run. A CSS is solely dependent on an HTML because it is taking content and elements from your HTML page to style and make them look beautiful on the browser to the front end to the user that is trying to access your web URL. So that is just it about CSS. And so in CSS, it is important to know what extension is the CSS framework saved in. So as I said earlier, that when you are writing HTML, you save your HTML with .html just to identify to the browser that I am writing an HTML file, or to whoever wants to see that I'm writing an HTML file. And majorly, why you have the HTML file is for you to inform the parser and the browser compiler, the browser parser that are working on that particular code. So that's just it. Then CSS is so important that it brings a lot of beauty to your site. So what's the first thing about CSS? You need to learn you need to learn how to make your site look nice. You need to be able to pick all your color combinations and the rest. Then you can apply them to your CSS. So that's it. And now let me go back to where I was coming from. I said, what extension is CSS being saved at? Like HTML now. HTML is saved with .html. So that's how the system is being saved. But but for you to save CSS, you need to have a file extension, or you need to change your file extension to .css. If you are writing a CSS file, your file extension needs to be .css. Are you guys there? The file extension must be .css. Do anybody have any questions before I proceed? Okay, so to save your CSS, the file extension for CSS, when you are saving your CSS, this is called .css. Yeah, okay. So when you save um your CSS file with your .css, you are telling the computer that this is a cascading style sheet. Then your browser can pick up and know how to pass it. So that is just the major work of a CSS. And also there are various ways of writing CSS in HTML. There are majorly various three different ways of writing HTML in CSS. So that's it. So let's start. So the CSS, when you are writing a CSS, please make sure you know these three things now. There are three methods at which CSS are being written. Three major methods at which CSS are living. CSS, CSS are being created and are being used in an application. Number one, we have the internal styling. So we have the internal styling. Yes. So those are we have the inline styling. We have the inline styling. We have inline styling, internal styling, and external styling. So those are the three things, three ways of which you can style your HTML: the inline styling, the internal styling, and external styling. Those three approach are the approach you can take to style your CSS. Okay, I'll share my data to show you example of what we mean by those three approach of styling documents. Those three approaches are needed when styling your document. So let me start. Um, um, so yeah, let me know if you guys can see my screen already. What do you say? Alright. So now let's start with the inline styling application system of CSS. So let's do it like this. For you to do inline styling for any HTML document, you need to style that document like as if you need to pass an attribute to that document that will allow you to style it, and from there you'll be able to read the internal styles. So that's what we call the inline styling. The inline styling is the kind of style that's always within the application. It is always within your HTML. That is what the inline styling is. Sorry, just a minute. So that is what the inline styling is. So let me quickly try an example for you. So now, let's say I want to make this H1 color. I want to make it red with internal styling. So this is what you do. You pass it in style, you pass a style property. Yes, and what is that called? You pass a style property, which is an attribute for your HTML. You pass a style attribute to the HTML to specify the kind of style that which you want to pass to your HTML. And so in CSS as well, we have two ways of writing your CSS. You have the custom way and you have the electronic approach. You also have the electronic approach. So that is that is it. So let me quickly talk about the style before I go back to that inline styling and things like that. So in CSS, when you are writing your CSS, there are major things that are very particular. The major things that are particular in CSS that you majorly be using or you majorly be interfacing with. We have what we call the selectors. So we have what we call selectors in CSS. We have what we call selectors. What did I call them? They are called selectors. We call them selectors in CSS. We call them CSS selectors. So why do we call them selectors? So these selectors are a way for which you make reference to a particular HTML element you want to style in your CSS. If you are not using an inline styling, if you are not using an inline styling, so um, those selectors are the way at which you want to make reference to um, are the way at which you want to make reference to elements or pages within the HTML. These are ways you want to make elements or um, comments in the HTML, making reference within the HTML. When you make a good reference between the HTML, uh, hello, yes, I can hear you. Okay, yes, yes, understand styling, yes, okay. All right. So I said before we continue to the inline, I said I was trying to explain what the inline stylings are. So when you want to do your inline styling, can you still see my screen? So when you want to when you want to do your inline styling, you use an attribute called style. Remember I told you that I remember I talked about HTML attributes. Hello. So remember I talked about HTML attribute. Style is an HTML attribute for you to make a reference within within your HTML element. With the style attribute on your HTML element, you can style that particular element. That is how it works. With the style, with the style on the HTML element, you can style that particular element. So now I said before I move on, I want to talk about the major things you need to know on CSS, like the way CSS particularly works. Like if you want to write your CSS. So there are things that when you want to style your CSS that you need to know. So the first thing first is called selectors. That's what I was trying to talk about. So called selectors. I think you guys got lost. I was trying to do something here. So it's called selectors. So they are called CSS selectors. So we call them selectors because that is how we make reference to an HTML element when we want to style them. So if you want to make reference to an HTML element, you use a selector within your CSS file. So do you get what I'm saying? Okay, so we use selectors, what we call selectors, within our CSS to make reference to that particular HTML file. And how do we make those? How do we do those selectors? So there are three major ways of which you can make reference to an HTML element within your CSS file. So we have the ID selector, we have the class selector, and we have the tag selector. So remember that in some of our, I told you that we are going to get to this point. At some point, we were talking about attribute, and I talked about class. I talked about ID. Yes, for our form, when you use form, when you specify ID on your form and you use for to tie the label to that particular input field. So you can also use that ID to make a reference to a particular HTML element in your CSS. I'm sure we are going to get to how to use that very soon. So as I said, we have the tag selector, we have the tag selector, class selector, and ID selector. Though there are other selectors as well. Like, okay, let me give you one more. We have the what we call the attribute selector. So there is something called the attribute selector as well. So like I would like you guys to go and read up more on other on other selectors that we have in CSS. But I just told you the first major four that are truly that are very dominant in CSS, which is the tag selector, class selector, and ID selector. So those are the major three. Those are the major three selectors in HTML. We also have what we call the attribute selectors. So you try to select an element based on the attributes that is present on it. I think later we'll get to that. Hello, Aresi, can you hear me? All right, so we'll get to that. So now let me quickly talk about the style now. Coming back to this style. So imagine if I want to give this, okay, before I also talk about the style. So if you are writing your CSS as well, I've talked about the way element are being selected in an HTML element being referenced. So we also have what we call properties and values. That is what HTML is majorly, CSS is majorly based on. So we usually have CSS properties and they have a value they can take. CSS has what we call CSS properties and the value they can take. CSS properties, that is what we call them. So most of everything you are doing to your HTML, you are just giving it some CSS, you are just doing some CSS property that is going to reference your HTML and style it. So that's just it. So we have what we call the CSS, we call them CSS properties and values. So there are different properties. We have the padding, we have the margin, we have the position, we have the display mode, we have text font size. So these are the things that you will use in styling your HTML elements after you have made reference to them, whether you are using the external, the internal, or the inline styling. So, but we have what we call the properties. The properties are the major building block of CSS. So it is through the properties that you specify on a reference or inside an inline styling or an internal styling for a particular element that is going to get referenced on that element and style that element. So now let me quickly start with the inline styling and show you an example of that. So we have what we call the color property on CSS. Color property. It's called the color property. So this color property, what we make use of it of is to style elements, is to style text, majorly style text in our application to set the color of what we want our text to be and things like that in our application. So for this style now, I'll specify a color for this our H1. I'll say color. So what should we give it? Let's do the purple. Fine. So color is purple. Now, as I said earlier, CSS has what we call the property and the value. So color is the property, purple is the value it can take. Color is the property, purple is the value it can take. That is the value that CSS property can take. Color is the property, purple is the value it can take. It can take other values aside purple. It can take yellow, it can take red, it can take many things. Color can also take hexadecimal values. Of which one we want to talk about color, we'll talk about it. What are hexadecimal values in your CSS, in your color scheme? Well, color can take hexadecimal values, it can take RGBA values, it can take HSL value, it can take HSLA value. So that is just it. But let's just use the purple as the default value. Now let me save it and trying to run this code so you can see it. So can you see my screen? So you can see that the color of that particular text has changed. The color of that particular text has changed. So that is how it works. And okay, let me first of all do the rest. So now that is how inline styling works. So majorly on any HTML element, you can put the style property and style them apart from elements that are not visible within the page. Okay, though okay, there are some elements that you can't style them with a particular property. I can't say elements that are not visible within the page because I wanted to talk about a BR, like a BR now. You can't style it with the color because it does not have like any text value. You can't use the color property on it. Nothing will happen because it does not even take any text value. So you can't use the color property on it. So that one now. So now let's talk about the internal styling. So now this is the first approach. This is the inline styling. This is the inline styling. So now let's talk about the internal styling. And so what is this internal styling? Internal styling is when you try to style your document in a way by so you put what we call the style, you use wait, nobody has told me this before. Okay. This one is not that time. Alright. So now let's talk about what the internal styling is. Now if I want to style my document internally, at the same time, when we call it internal document, you are still writing your CSS within that HTML file as well. But this time, you are not writing it within the element. So that is just the difference of the internal and inline styling. Your style is within that same page at the same time, but this time it is inside the page but not within the element. So when you want to do what we call internal styling, we have a tag that we call the style tag, like your normal HTML tag, head tag. So it is called the style tag. That is what we call it. It is called the style tag. Style tag. So now within that style tag, you start to write your HTML, your CSS. So that is how it works. We have what we call the style tag that that looks like other HTML that looks like other HTML tag. But this time it is an HTML tag, but you don't put your HTML content under it. You write your CSS properties under this tag. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? You write your CSS properties under that tag using your referencing. Do you get what I'm saying? All right, I'm listening. Okay, so I'll answer that question very soon. So let's go. So now, remember I told you that when you are writing your CSS, you have to have selectors of which particular element you want to select. Now let us talk about that. Under your style tag, for you to style anything, you need to select that particular element you want to style. Whether it's the body tag, whether it's the body element or any element within your page. Now, okay, that remains. So let's write our style above the body, not the style tag. So now let's try and change the background color of our body, of the body of our page. So now that this one, I want to use a tag selector. I'm trying to use a tag selector now. So that is what we call tag selector. You can select an element by the tag. So now I'm going to use to select the tag selector. To use a tag selector, I'll just use the name of the tag element, body. Then if you are writing your CSS for any of your elements. After you have used your selector, after you have typed in your selector, then you surround it with a curly braces. So which is an opening and closing curly brace in your CSS. It is because of you are using the style as an inline element here, as an inline styling. You don't need all those. You don't need all this. You don't need to do all this within the style here. If you want to add more properties within your inline, all you need to do is then you do another property again. So, but here, after you have selected your property, the after you have used your body in your selector property, which is the body, and that is the tag selector, you want to change all the color. So now we have what we call background color in CSS. So I'll change the background color to ash. Let me just use the color code. So now I want to change the background color of our body to ash. I've saved it. Now let me refresh. Hello. Hello. Does anybody have a question? Because I hear someone talking. What do you say? To the page, abi? Can you see the purple change? No, I've not refreshed the page. I've not refreshed the page. So have you seen it now? That is now ash. Okay, let's use black. No, if we use black, the content won't show. Let's use maybe red. Something that is something you can see vividly. Yeah. Can you see that now? So we just use what we call the tag selector. This is what we call the tag selector. And this color that I did hashtag DDD, it is called the hexadecimal approach of using color. Hexadecimal approach of using colors. So color, we have most of the time, your color usually have a color code. Colors have what we call color code. Hello. All right. So um the we have what we call the color code. See, color code. Every color you see has what we call color code. You can look up their color code online for different color because we have a lot of variations of color, and they usually have their color code. So if you do want, if when you are giving maybe a background color or a color property a value, because background color also is a property, color is a property. So when you are trying to give them a value, you can either use the color name if it is present in in CSS. You can either use the color name, and if the color name is not present, you use the color code. The color code, when you pass in the color code, the browser is able to interpret that. So do you guys understand now? So the browser is able to interpret that. Now this is what we call, let's now go back to what we're talking about. This is what we call the internal styling. This approach is called the internal styling, whereby you are styling your HTML document, your HTML body within the same HTML file under your style tag by making a reference to those elements, whether by the tag selector, class selector, or ID selector. So now what we just do now, the selector we make use of to reference the body was the tag selector. So that's what we did. This H1 now, we can do, we can also try and change the color from this point. And now you guys, you know the difference. Color. Let's give it brown. Saddle down. Uh okay, then let me tell you what will happen for yet. So let's refresh. So okay. So who can tell me what's happening here? It means there are two H1 on this page. There are two H1 on this page. That is why you have a brown here and you have a purple here. But who can tell me what is happening? Why this one retain the purple, then this guy has changed to a brown? No, now they are both H1 now. So there's no different selectors. I used H1 in, so anytime I use H1, even when I use a tag selector, when you are doing your referencing in your CSS. So when you use a tag selector, it is going to pick any element that has that tag, any element that is using that tag, any H1 element on that page, it will style them like that. Same thing with a class selector. When you are using a class selector, when you try to style any element that has that class value attribute in HTML, it will style those classes like that. Only the ID is different. Only the ID selector is different. It only styles one element. When you use ID on any element, you don't try to use it on two elements because it will cause a bug. If you are thinking it will style all the it will style the element in multiple places. No, it will only style the first element that has that ID value. It will only style that element. It won't style any other element that is also using that particular ID on the page. It will not style them. So now when because we use a tag selector, it is supposed to okay. A style selector. Wait, a style select. No, I said a tag selector. We don't have style selector. Yes, 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 yes. It will have that same color. Yeah, it will have that same color because they are all H1. We're using a tag selector. So they will have that, they will pick up those properties that will specify on that H1 tag or on that element tag since we are using the tag selector. But if you look at what we did here, that even when this one has H1 selector, this guy has H1 selector, this guy has H1 selector, this guy updated, but this guy did not update. So let me just tell you the reason. So the reason is because in your CSS, if you look at this point, if you look at this first H1, you see that we did an inline styling on it that changed the color to purple at this point. Did you see that? So but this one, the other H1 element that is on this page, let me try and look for it. Okay, look at it. This is the H1 that is here. This one that is here. The H1 that is here now, this web development. If you look at it, you will see that we did not style it at all. We did not style it with our inline styling. So anytime you style an element, maybe in an internal styling or an external styling, and you try to style them inline again, the inline styling overrides the internal styling you have done on that element, or the external external styling you've done on that element. This your internal styling is going to overwrite it. If I remove this type property, this style attribute now, and the value from this particular H1, and let's go and refresh, you see that it has also updated to become brown. Do you guys get what I'm saying? So now if I return the property back and I refresh, it has become back to purple. Because why? There's hierarchy to those styling. If I style something in the external in my external CSS, though we have not talked about external CSS because we're about to end the class. Talk about that next week. Sorry, on Thursday. So if I style an element in my external CSS. Then I come again to my internal CSS to style it. My internal CSS will overwrite my external CSS. Do you guys understand that? So my internal CSS property or my external CSS property styling will override what I've styled that element in my external file. But there is also a way that you can do it, that even though you have styled it in your internal CSS, even though you styled in your internal CSS, your external can still overwrite the rest. There's a particular thing you can do, or there's a particular keyword, they call it keyword, a particular keyword you need to put on those properties. But when you get there, we'll talk about it. But naturally, following hierarchy, the internal CSS is more specific than the external CSS. Then the inline CSS, which is the styling you give on the element itself, has more power is powerful over the internal CSS. The inline CSS will overwrite both the external and the internal. The inline CSS will overwrite the two of them, while the internal will overwrite the external. So that is just the basic introduction to CSS and how CSS works. So next week, guys, we are going to go deeper on how CSS works. But my assignment for you this week is write out like 100 properties of CSS, because they are a lot. I don't think even me myself, I still keep discovering new CSS every day, and obviously the technology environment is not static. There's always new introduction to tech, new introduction of APIs. So for Thursday, please submit 100 properties of CSS because you need them. There are tests on fonts, there are properties on fonts, there are properties on images, there are properties on video, there are properties on animation, there are properties on color, there are properties on background. A lot of CSS properties, like a lot of CSS properties. That even when you become a full developer, you still Google some because you won't remember everything. So, all right, guys. Thank you for attending today's class. Um, yeah, I'll see you guys on Thursday and expecting to see your feedback on your assignment. All right, bye. Hello, yes, I can hear you. All right, okay, uh, okay, 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 okay.